Good day, brothers and sisters in Christ. Welcome back to my channel. We're moving into Ezekiel chapter 38 and then 39. And this is quite a significant portion of Ezekiel's book. And these two chapters are literally the preparation for what is going on in the world today, in the Middle East. And we need to have a look at it and rightly divide the word of truth and see where things are lying currently as well as biblically. So I've put together quite a lengthy and in-depth recording for today, for chapter 38. So let's have a look at my notes first of all, and then we'll have a look at some other information that I've got regarding the current affairs of what is going on in the world. So in Ezekiel chapter 38 we see that it's significant end times prophecy, and there are many reasons for this. It's due to the fact that there's a deception or a depiction of the future conflict in the Middle East surrounding Israel regarding what the Bible terms the region called Gog and Magog, which many of the scholars, biblical scholars, have interpreted as a pivotal event in the eschatological timeline of the Bible. So we see the prophecy of Gog and Magog, which introduces Gog, who is the leader of a land called Magog, and describes as well a coalition of nations that will come against Israel in the latter days. We see that in chapter 38 verses 1 to 6. And this prophecy also is associated with the final battle against God's people, making it a focal point in eschatological discussions, the end time prophecy discussions. So let's have a look and see specifically look at Yahweh drawing Gog to attack Israel, verses 1 to 3. God against Gog of the land of Magog. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tabor. Prophesy against him and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tabor. Set your face against Gog of the land of Magog. In this general context, God's restoration of Israel, here Ezekiel prophesies against Gog, who is the ruler of the area called Magog. Here Gog is noted as the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tabor. So in my footnotes, identifying God and the battle described in this chapter has interested many interpreters and students of the Bible in the prophecy sense. Since ancient times, it is difficult to entirely have a clear solution to this prophecy for several reasons. There is no other Old Testament description for our connection or for the connection with God apart from 1 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 4, which seems to have no relevance to this passage. God seems to be a holy and new and strange enemy to Israel. Magog is also mentioned as a descendant of Japheth in Genesis chapter 10 verse 2 and 1 Chronicles chapter 1 verse 5, but is never presented as a threat or an enemy to Israel in any Old Testament passage. The phrase Prince of Rosh has also been translated as a chief prince, which gives the idea that the word Rosh describes the greatness of the prince, not a place where the prince rules. However, translators and interpreters do not agree if it should be Prince of Rosh or Chief Prince. So here we need to understand, if Rosh is understood as a name of a people or a place, it has no other connection or reference in the Old Testament. There are many who think that Rosh speaks of Russia or the Russians, but the only direct evidence for this is just in the similar sounding of the names. Meshach and Tabul were peoples to the north of Israel, somewhere near the Black Sea or the Caspian Sea. These were people nowhere else noted in the Old Testament for any threat or animosity against Israel. Though the names Meshach and Tabul have similar sounds to Russia's cities of Moscow and Tobolsk. However, similar sounding names alone are not enough to make certain the connection with Russia and her cities. Morgan, however, also says in a quote that none of these enemies are the old traditional enemies which we are familiar with as hostile to Israel. It is a totally new confederacy and antagonism towards Israel. However, some of the older commentators, such as Matthew, Poole, and John Trapp, as well as Adam Clark, also identify Gog, right, with Antiochus Epiphanes V, the great persecutor of the Jewish people in the period between the Old and the New Testament. However, when we look further into progressive revelation, we see it's extremely unlikely that this is the case. However, others have seen Gog as a king who lived more than 100 years before Ezekiel's time. The king of Lydia, for instance. However, this is also very unlikely due to the context and the application of the prophecy. So, let's have a look and see what Alexander says here in this quote about the land of Magog. Magog, a Japhethic descendant. Okay, so in Genesis chapter 10 verse 2, we see that Magog is a descendant of Japheth. In the table of nations, it's identified by Josephus in his writings as the land of the Scythians, a mountainous region around the Black or the Caspian seas. And generally, this position is accepted. However, Feinberg on Rosh states that the Byzantine and Arabic readers in their secular books have mentioned a people called Rush who inhabit the country of Taurus and reckoned among the Scythians. There have been many writers who connect the name Rosh with Russia, but this is not generally accepted today. It's an tempting idea to identify Rosh with Russia, and therefore Meshach with Moscow and Tabor with Tobolshla, both the cities in Russia. But we would have a hard time, honestly, defending this on linguistics grounds, as this doesn't rule out the participation of a modern Russia, since it is located north of Israel. However, we need to realize that it's neither does it demand it as well. That was quote from Vesper that I found. Meshach and Tabor, the biblical and extra-biblical data gathered, though sparse, would imply that Meshach and Tabor refer to a geographical area or countries in eastern Turkey, southwest of Russia, and northwest of Iran. That's what Alexander comes up with. However, John Trapp gives an example of a spectacular guessing regarding the identity of the people mentioned here. Trapp wrote that Meshach represented the Muslims and Tabor represented the Roman Catholics. These two are co-joined to show as something that the Turks and the Popelings, or the Roman Catholics, shall be at length to join forces to root out the true religion, and that while they are endeavoring to bring down the church's downfall, Christ shall come upon them and confound them. However, let's just have a look at a map I've got here. So we're talking about in the first couple of verses, 1 to 6, we see that here's Meshach and Tabor, the Russian area, Persia, and this here is Dedan, which is mentioned a lot in Daniel. This is Cush, this is Put. These are all the region, and this is Gomer. These are all the regions that are identified as people groups that form a coalition under Magog and come against. There's Israel. So let's have a look now. Carry on. Behold, I am against you, O God, the Prince of Rosh. Though the similar sounding names do not certainly identify Rosh with Russia, the identification matches what we do know about Gog and Rosh. We know they are new, and they are a previously unnamed enemy of the Israelites, unlike the Babylonians and the Syrians or the Egyptians. That is, the ruler of Gog rules over more than one people. He also includes ruling over Meshach and Tabor, and that Gog's territory is found in the far north in respect of Israel. And so we see that in this map here, the far north. Here's Israel, and this is the far north. So these are the people that Gog is ruling over, this area here. Okay. However, we need to understand that unlike the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Babylonians, with whom Judah had frequent contact, the people in the distant north were shrouded in mystery. There were reports of these mysterious people groups that filtered down, and they are spoken of a wild people, brutal and barbaric. This combination of mystery and brutality made Gog and his confederates, those areas where he has ruled over, a perfect symbol for the enemy rising against God and his people. That's what Bloch says. However, Feinberg wrote in a summary of Ezekiel 38 and 39, he says that these two chapters tell or interpret literally of a coming northern confederacy of nations about the Black and Caspian Seas, with Persia and North Africa coming together. and they will invade the promised land after Israel's restoration. So in verses 4 to 6, we see God's promises to turn and pull Gog to attack Israel. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and lead you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed, and a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all its troops, the house of Tamar from the far north and all its troops, many people are with you. I will turn you around and put hooks in your jaw and lead you out. Here God promised to bring Gog with all his armies against Israel. Whatever Gog's own motivations for attack and invasions might be, there would be an overriding divine purpose for this. There are some who see Gog as a leader of Russia and have offered many ideas as to why Russia would invade Israel. And some of them are, there is an option for a warm water port. There's also a desire from Russia to intervene in the Middle East for the sake of its oil. There's also a desire for the Dead Sea minerals in that area. However, at the same time, there is an active Russian military involvement in Syria right now, in support of the Syrian government that at times has been hostile to Israel. But we need to remember, in recent times, up to 2 weeks, a month ago, there's been a overtaking of the Syrian Assad government by Islamic jihadists, and Russia has pulled out its support from that area. So now we need to see and understand that a reader might weigh such possibilities for himself or herself with the understanding that the political and military circumstances is consistently changing. Yet despite whatever human motivation may be present, the ultimate reason is that God said he would compel Gog to come against Israel. Okay. So here let's just have another look at a Middle East map, and these are all the Arab nations against Israel. You can see Israel right there, and you've got Iran, there's Iraq, there's Syria, there's Gaza with Hamas, there's Islamic Jihad, you've got here in Lebanon, you've got Hezbollah, and then you've got the Houthis in Yemen, and they are all converging and are hostile, most definitely, and want to take out Israel completely. And we see that Iran plays a key role. And Iran is influencing Kuwait and Bahrain as well in recent days. So there's a very hostile area in the Middle East in current times. So let's go back. With all your armies, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed. Here Ezekiel describes the army with terms that made sense to him and most of human history. There was a great, large, fast, well-equipped army ready to conquer. Morgan says here in a quote, here the prophet saw the final manifestation of antagonism against Jehovah and his people. He saw it gathering itself in a terrifying force. The mightiest alliance that had ever acted against Israel. So that's what Ezekiel describes here, that Morgan is quoting about. And Block says there, these verses create an impression that God is an imperial power with vast military resources. And then Feinberg also says in his third quote, some have found it greatly difficult to find in the references of armor and buckler and shield and sword and helmet. But even in our day of advanced weaponry and warfare, it is interesting to learn that in some parts of the world, in their conflicts, it's still going on with primitive weapons. And how else could an ancient writer have described that type of warfare? He knew nothing about planes and guns. So, our concern is not only to understand what the common sense interpretation of this passage indicates. So we need to apply our common sense and put our mind in the mindset of Ezekiel at the day when he received this vision. Then we move down to Persia and Ethiopia and Libya are with them. So coming from the far north, God also has allies to the west, which is Persia, to the south, which is Ethiopia, and to the east, which is Libya. Okay. Gomer and all its troops, the house of Tamar from the far north. Most regard Gomer as the people from Cappadocia in modern-day Turkey. The house of Tamar is often regarded as the Armenian people in the north of Israel. Gomer, probably the ancient Cimmerians, and Beth Tamar, possibly the ancient Tul-Gramur, southeast of the Black Sea. So let's just go back to have a look at this area. So we're talking about, here's the Black and Caspian Sea, here's Persia. So these are people are from this area here. Okay. So now, Gomer identifies as a wild tribe living in the fog-bound regions north of the Black Sea. perhaps as far west as the Crimean Peninsula. So here we see the mention of specific nations communicating at least two impressions. The nations allied with Gog and Magog will come from every direction against Israel. We need to remember that the number of listed nations allied to Gog and Magog is 7, perhaps indicating in biblical sense a completeness or fulfillment of opposition to Israel. We're going to leave it here, end of part 1, and we'll carry on part 2. So you can just keep an eye out on the feed on my YouTube channel for part 2. We'll carry on with the invasion of Israel in Ezekiel chapter 38. Folks, have a blessed week, and I trust and believe as we reflect on chapter 38, we'll have more insight, and may God's peace keep you. Until next week, have a blessed week.